The proceeding will start shortly.
We shall kick off. Order, order. Welcome to this session of the Foreign Affairs Committee, where we will be looking at the two-state solution to the Israel-Palestine conflict. We have a really fabulous set of guests to hear from today, and I'm going to ask each of them to kindly introduce themselves. Gershom, if you can kindly kick us off.
Yes, my name is Gershom Gorenberg. I am an Israeli journalist and historian, the author, among other books, of 2 successive histories of Israeli settlement in the occupied territories.
Perfect. Khalidi.
My name is Rashid Khalidi. I'm the Edward Said Professor of Modern Arab Studies at Columbia University. I studied in the UK, and I've written 8 books, of which 3 or 4 deal with Palestinian history.
Perfect. Colonel Miri Eisin.
Good morning. My name is Miri Eisin. I'm Israeli. I'm a retired colonel. I served in the Israeli intelligence community and then as the Israeli Prime Minister's international media advisor. And I teach at Reichman University narratives. I teach a lot of Rashid Khalidi's books.
Very good. It's always good to start with a point of agreement. Gershom, if I can start with you, please. How do we reconcile Zionism with Palestinian nationalism to ensure that we end up with a peaceful resolution?
Well, I think the basic starting point is the reality of today, which is that there are 2 national groups located in the same land, each with very different but valid claims to that as being their homeland, and neither of which are going anywhere. And therefore, the political necessity is finding a way for those 2 national movements to achieve at least some of their goals and national self-determination while recognizing the rights and existence of the other.
Thank you very much. Does anyone else want to comment on that at all? Rashid?
Can I step in with a small thing?
Please, please.
I think that what Gershon has said, I agree. I would add that it's also calling out on both sides what I'm going to call the spoilers, meaning there are forces that can be very violent forces that are against these aspirations, and calling them out to me is also part of how you arrive at a resolution.
And do you think the international community has failed as yet to call out these spoilers?
I think the international community has very clear-cut ideas of what should be done. And I think there's a difference between what should be done and what can be done. And in that sense, you don't necessarily call out all spoilers in their names. And each side in its own way does not view usually what I'm going to call spoilers as being a spoiler. So it's not about the international community in that sense. It's really about how each domestic side views it. And as I said, the difference between what you can do and what you should do.
Thank you. I may take you back to that comment later. Please, Dr. Khalidi.
Yeah, I would add to that I think it's important to bring in something that is generally ignored, which is the balance of forces. There are 2 national projects, obviously. One of them has always been backed by the world's most powerful states, the United Kingdom for decades, and then others, the United States most importantly. And the other has never been able to achieve any of its national objectives, partly for reasons having to do with great powers, partly for reasons having to do with the desire of the Zionist movement to take over all of Palestine, and partly because of its own failures. But I think it's incumbent on the international community, which played an enormous role in creating this problem, to help to bring about a solution, which it has manifestly failed to do over many, many, many decades.
Thank you so much. Great.
Miri, first, if I may. It's a long time ago, but are there any lessons that can be learned from the failure of the Peel plan in trying to build to a 2-state solution?
Well, the Peel plan at its heart to me is what we talk about 2 states. And I actually think that in the sense, the British, in their very, as Rashid said before, I mean, it's from an outside viewpoint, but it looks and says 2 different nations and the whole issue of Jerusalem as being something which I like, maybe not in the Peel Commission, it was to belong to Great Britain, but the idea of Jerusalem being something that belongs to the world. And I think that in that sense, those are lessons that we should be looking at, including today. And I say this as an Israeli that's very aware that the Jerusalem issue is one of the things that Israelis don't know how to compromise on, and we need to. I think that that international voice that comes out and talks about Jerusalem as being something otherworldly that needs to have something different within a resolution is very important for both sides. The additional aspect is that partition is a compromise, not a Disney happily ever after. And I actually think that both the Peel Commission and all of the partition plans as they went on, look at, again, it's about what should and can be done as opposed to what each side wants. There are Zionists. I'm a very proud Zionist who is very liberal and absolutely wants two states and have for my entire life. And there are other Zionists who want the whole thing. And I acknowledge that in that sense. And I think that the Peel Commission looked at two different peoples and said, here's the compromise, not here's the happily ever after.
Thank you. Is there any
Yeah, if I could just add to what Colonel Eisin said, I think one of the problems with the Peel Commission, with every one of these proposals for partition, but the Peel Commission in particular, is that it initiated the idea that in order to have the compromise that Colonel Eisin talks about, enormous harm had to be done to the Palestinians. It came up with the idea of transfer, which meant the expulsion of, in this case, hundreds of thousands of Palestinians, 200,000 Palestinians, from what was to have been a Jewish state in 1937. And I think that is part of the problem. That what has actually happened has been put forward in the name of compromise, but it has involved enormous harm to the majority population of Palestine, whether that was in 1937 with the Peel Plan, which of course never eventuated, or whether that was in 1947 with the United Nations General Assembly partition, which would have created a Jewish state with almost half of its population Arab, which necessitated, in effect, the transfer, i.e. the expulsion of those people. That is a problem that the Peel Plan, in fact, initiated, and which we are living with ever since. The expulsion of people from their homes in 1948 and again in 1967, and the kind of dispossession and expulsion we're seeing now in the Gaza Strip.
Sorry.
If I may add just 2 points to that. One, in relation to what Miri Eisin said, I think it's important to stress this idea that we're not looking for utopias. The late Israeli political scientist Yaron Ezrahi would say that politics does not contain solutions, it contains better and worse arrangements. So we're looking for the least bad arrangement rather than for perfection. Second of all, in relationship to 1948, I would note that the result of the partition without enacted by international fiat, but with no international involvement to ensure that it was carried out, was in fact the flight and expulsion of most of the Palestinian population of what became Israel. On the other hand, the Israeli archival record shows clearly that the plans of the Zionist leadership at the beginning of the state were that the Arab population would stay put, and in fact the administrative plan for the state of Israel found in the Israeli state archives shows that there was planning including how to take care of the educational, medical, and other needs of the Arab population, of all of the towns and villages that were supposed to be included in the Jewish state. So I think that one of the implications of this is that international decisions that involve no follow-up, that were not carried through by any attempt to bring about the peaceful enactment of those arrangements, was disastrous. It's not enough in that case for the United Nations or for any further international involvement to propose a solution or arrangement if it's not going to stay involved and ensure that that arrangement is carried out in peaceful fashion.
Thank you.
Just very, very briefly, and I don't know who wants to come into this, and you tell me if I'm getting this wrong, but for me as an outsider, what I see is one side that thinks it is too powerful to have to compromise, and a weaker side that thinks it is so embittered that it is almost impossible to compromise with any sense of dignity left because it has so little to compromise over. How would you think that's an unfair comment, and how would you finesse that and improve it to anyone who wants to answer that point?
Well, I would agree that there's an enormous imbalance, but the enormous imbalance is partly due to the power of Israel itself, obviously, but also to the big fat thumb of the United States and the international community, or I should say the Western countries that support the United States, in supporting Israel to the hilt. So Palestinians feel that they're not only up against one of the most powerful armies in the world, they're up against the United States, they're up against Great Britain, they're up against Germany, they're up against all the countries that support Israel, that arm Israel, that fund the settlements in the occupied territories, that issue veto after veto in the UN Security Council. So there is an imbalance, but that imbalance could, at least in part, be corrected if that big fat thumb were removed from the scales and there were a bit of impartiality and a bit of respect for UN resolutions that would argue that call settlements illegal or that call the occupation illegal. The international community has issued statements with absolutely no power behind them. If occupation is illegal, end occupation. If settlements are illegal, stop funding them, stop arming the people who defend them. And I think that in and of itself would help somewhat to right the balance and to, I think, bring Israelis to reason. They think that they can play with the power of the greatest superpower on earth behind them. And Palestinians feel that not only are they overwhelmed by Israel, obviously, but that they are facing this panoply of Western countries that support Israel.
Thank you. Either our other two guests want to come in on that?
I'd like to jump in for a moment. I think that perhaps as I listened to you say that, and as I was listening to Professor Khalidi, it's one of those biggest gaps. And here I'm going to say something as an Israeli, that the oddest part, and I say it is odd, of Israeli psyche is that we so do not think of ourselves as powerful. We think of ourselves not as weak, but as our need in that sense, both to have our strength versus what we perceive as enemies. Professor Khalidi, not just the Palestinians. Our strength is not just about the occupation and about the West Bank, the Gaza Strip, or East Jerusalem. It's about our entire location surroundings, including right now in a very odd way. And I say that because it's a very deep sense, which I do think that the international community do not recognize. It's not about agreeing with it. It's about there being vastly different ways of looking at this. And we do not perceive ourselves not as strong, not as the one that in that sense that the strength itself comes from the outside, au contraire. I think if anything that's happening right now is our need to be strong on our own, our understanding. I mean, the saying in Hebrew is at the end, we're going to be the ones alone, standing alone. It's very Jewish. Im en ani li mili, if I don't have myself, who else do I have? And I just put that in there as an observation, not from the expert point of view, but as an Israeli.
Thank you.
Yeah. 2 points on this. One is the actual geopolitical situation, which from the Israeli perception, even I would say the view reflected by professionals in the field is, yes, there is an alliance with the United States, but a very strong awareness of powerful enemies in the region that strongly affect the balance. In particular today, Iran and its allies, which reduce the sense of protectiveness or power. The second thing is to agree with Miri Eisin on the psychological level. The best formulation of this was the title of a book by historian Benny Morris, Righteous Victims. The phrase righteous victims could apply to the consciousness of both sides, which is that the irony you discover in the consciousness of each side is that it is the righteous side and that it has been victimized. Now, I would say that historically there are flaws in all of that, both the righteous and the victims part. But I think that any international player coming into the situation has to deal with, in effect, both of what my colleagues have said, the actual power situation and the perceptions or self-consciousness of the group involved. Ignoring the latter factor is the story told by each side is one of the reasons for the failure of diplomatic peace efforts in the past.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Chair, and good afternoon. Gershom, could I ask you, in the context of the history of this conflict, how important is the settler movement in the West Bank? And in a future resolution of the conflict, can the settlers remain where they are?
The settlements are obviously a very crucial factor. I would not isolate them, as some have had, and make it into the only factor. To make the settlements the only issue ignores crucial other issues in conflict resolution, including the issue already mentioned of Jerusalem, of the refugees, and I could add to that list. However, the project of settling Israelis in the occupied territories, and particularly in the West Bank, since 1967 is a deliberate barrier to a territorial compromise. And the increase in those numbers is a project intended from the beginning to either limit the degree of compromise possible or eliminate it entirely. That's an important distinction. Moderates who backed settlement in specific areas sought to limit the amount of land that Israel could give up, in a sense tying the hands of Israeli governments in the future. Hardliners aimed at preventing giving up territory in general. However, I would add one more factor to this. The claim that it is impossible for the number of Israelis living in the West Bank to return to Israel proper ignores the experience of other countries. And the best example I can give you here is a historical example. I'm not claiming that anything is a precise parallel, but it's an example worth looking at, is that in 1975, an estimated 500,000 Portuguese colonists from Africa returned to Portugal, a country that had a population of under 10 million at the time. Portugal has survived. I'm sure that it created tremendous social and economic stress. But this took place, and it allowed Portugal to proceed into its future without continuing its colonial project in Africa. For the settlers, or a large portion of the settlers in the West Bank, to return to Israel is a possibility that must be entertained, and is not a reason to give up on the idea of a peace agreement based on territorial compromise.
Thank you. Would anyone like to come in on that? Dr. Khalidi?
Rashid, you're on mute.
Sorry about that. I would agree with what Gershom said in certain respects. I think that the settler project is not just a project of an extreme wing of the Israeli political establishment. It is the Israeli state since the Alon Plan, since 1967. The objective has been clothed in the mantle of security, but was always, I think, I agree with Gershom, to make handing over this territory impossible. And it has become, in recent decades, I would say, more than that. It has become the spearhead of an effort to do what Zev Jabotinsky said way back in the 1920s, transform Palestine into the land of Israel, to make, real on the ground, a reality whereby there's really only one sovereign people. And the Palestinians can live, if they obey Israeli laws and do what the Israelis say, can live around that area, which constantly expands. 60% of the West Bank is under Israeli control. There are 700,000 Israeli settlers between the occupied West Bank and occupied Arab East Jerusalem. And they're not there simply to prevent the Palestinian state from being established. They're there in order to establish the complete hegemony of the Jewish people over the entirety of what is called the land of Israel. And again, this goes back to the very earliest ideas of the very earliest Zionist leaders, from Herzl through Jabotinsky and Ben Gurion and Weizmann to the present, to Begin and Shamir and the current prime minister.
And Dr. Khalidi, sticking with the historical context, can I ask you to tell us a little bit about the origins and the development of Palestinian nationalism?
Mm-hmm. Palestinian nationalism, ironically, develops pretty much at the same time and under many of the same influences as Zionism and every other nationalism in the Middle East. My great-great-great-grandfather, and probably my two distinguished representative speakers before your committee, our grandparents did not think of themselves as Israelis or Palestinians. They thought of themselves in entirely different senses. They thought of themselves as Jews, they thought of themselves as Muslims or Christians. These national identities are entirely recent. And so Palestinian identity, people thought of a place called Palestine. Palestine existed in people's minds. But the idea of Palestinian identity as your primary focus of identity is a late 19th, early 20th century idea, as is Zionism. Both claim ancient roots, of course, both claim ties to the land. But they are rather similar, ironically, similar national movements. Obviously, Zionism grows up in Eastern Europe. It's a response to the persecution of Jews in Eastern Europe, to the anti-Semitism of millennia in Europe generally. Jews were kicked out of England in the 12th century, out of France in the 13th century, out of Portugal and Spain at the end of the 15th century. That's in part what Zionism is a response to. Palestinian nationalism has other roots, but both of them are relatively recent national projects, which, as I say, the great-great-great-grandparents of all of your witnesses would not have seen as their primary focus of identity. They would not have seen themselves as Israelis who have to live in a Jewish state in the land of Israel, nor would they have seen themselves as part of a Palestinian nation or state.
Would anyone else like to come in on that? Gershom?
Yes, I'd like to add two glosses to my colleagues' comments. First of all, regarding the settlements and the project of settlements, I would agree that this was and continues to be a major project of the state, not just of extreme political elements. The first settlements in occupied territory after 1967 were, of course, established under a Labor Party government. And in fact, the prime advocates within that government of settlement in the occupied territories were those who were identified as most left-wing in the government, whose conception was that the mandatory borders and the partition borders were an imperialist imposition dividing up the Jewish homeland. This is all very ironic in terms of today's thinking, but that's what the situation was then. However, one of the results of the settlement project has been actually to encourage the development of more extreme ideology, because the settlements themselves have become a hotbed of extremism. I would not agree that that was always the view of all Zionist leaders. I think that it's worth looking back, for instance, to 1949. The first motion of no confidence in the first Israeli government followed the signing of the armistice agreement with Transjordan. The right-wingers, led by leader of a then small minority party, Menachem Begin, challenged this concession of part of the homeland. Ben Gurion said, we were faced with a choice between the whole land without a Jewish state, that is to say without a Jewish majority, or a Jewish majority without the whole land. We chose a Jewish state without the whole land. So the concept of pragmatic compromise on perhaps larger aspirations was there from the beginning. And there has been an oscillation in Israeli politics ever since then between those two camps. And one last comment about national consciousness. Nationalism in the modern sense of belonging to a nation means that you have to have sovereignty is certainly, I certainly agree with what Professor Khalidi said. I think one of the things that's interesting about the history of the conflict is that the process of Jewish immigration into Palestine or Eretz Israel actually began throughout the 19th century. in a slowly developing pattern. And the early immigrants, many of them coming from elsewhere in the Islamic world, wanted to live in that land, but preceded the idea that this was a political project to gain sovereignty. That consciousness developed in a back and forth process, a dialectical process in which the aspirations of each national group tended to intensify the national consciousness of the other group. There is a very close relationship between the development of national consciousness and its intensity among Jews and Palestinians.
Thank you. And Dr. Khalidi, just before we bring in, can I just ask you, obviously the PA government resigned over the weekend. What does the future Palestinian leadership look like when you look to the next few months? And how is the Palestinian dream of the nationalist ambitions realised?
Well, any Palestinian government that doesn't represent the entirety of Palestinian opinion, any Palestinian government that's not ultimately the result of a democratic process, will represent essentially funders, donors, and great powers. And I'm afraid that's where we may be going, whether they're Arab powers or whether they're the United States or other countries. The Palestinians have often suffered from a democratic deficit, if I may. There haven't been elections since 2005 and 2006, a presidential election 2005, parliamentary 2006. And this is partly the fault of the Palestinians themselves, the fault of the PA leadership. And it's partly the fault of powers that should be pushing for democracy rather than encouraging the kind of autocratic regime that's developed in the PA. You're not going to resolve this unless everybody is represented. Ireland was not solved in the 20s, and the troubles were not resolved in the 80s and 90s without everybody at the table. South Africa was not solved without everybody at the table. And that is going to be necessary sooner or later on a democratic basis, as far as Palestine is concerned. If you don't bring the representatives of the people involved to the table, you will not get a deal that's worth the paper it's written on. I'm afraid that may not be happening soon enough, and that's largely a problem, a Palestinian problem. Palestinian divisions are a Palestinian problem, but they are encouraged and exacerbated by external intervention, vetoes on this or that or the other participant. Palestinians don't particularly like sitting down with Israelis whom they may consider war criminals, but they have no choice. Those would be the generals, those would be the officials, those would be the elected members of the Knesset or the government, whom the Israeli people have chosen. That's the way it is, and that's the way it has to be. But with the Palestinians, unfortunately, that's not allowed to be the case. And that, to my way of thinking, is a problem. So a government is about to be formed. It will not be based on any kind of democratic process. And it will therefore lack legitimacy. So the deal that it may cut, if it does in fact do that, will not have the support of the Palestinians because they were not consulted.
That's really helpful. Thank you, Henry.
Colonel Eisin, if I can turn to you, what do you believe the Israelis and the Palestinians have in common, even if that is a desire for stability and peace? And is there a great desire amongst the Israeli people and the Palestinians as well, in your opinion, for a settlement to the solution?
It's such a wonderful question, isn't it? The one that we all want a happy answer to. So glad I'm the one who gets to dive into this one here right now. We're in 2024. I cannot ignore where I am and how we are living in 2024. But I will say the following is things that we have in common. I think that both peoples, and I say this as peoples, we have multiple identities, and we have within us the capabilities to change. And I don't say that lightly. I think that over the last 120 years of conflict, this conflict has evolved, the peoples have evolved, and I say this as a positive thing. I may not like the present evolution of Hamas going to me much more extreme than they were in the past in the way that I viewed them as an expert, part of my own, in that sense, mistake. But I think that looking towards the future, both sides have the capability to change, and that's very important in any kind of conflict. I think that both of them want to live within the land, and that common ground in that sense means that we need to reach out and to talk to each other. But it's very hard right now in 2024 to look just at those points. I have to point out for a moment some of the things that may look the same, because listening both to Professor Khalidi and to Gershom, I mean, I listen to that and I wonder in what ways. In Israel right now, the presence in the last 4.5 months have made what I would call central Israelis, the ones who were for two states, who were willing to reach out. The voices that we hear right now are much less nuanced, and this conflict is about having nuance. If you have multiple identities, you're not just Israeli. You're Israeli, you're yes or no Zionist, you're Jewish, you're Arab. There's so many different identities that we bring to the table, and I think that multiple identities are something that we need to have to be able to reach and look and see each other. But in the commonalities right now, both sides need to sideline their extremists, and we each have extreme voices. And I say that I still strongly believe that in Israel, in a democracy, we may not do enough, but I think that we do a lot against the extreme voices. We try to call them out. We were out on the streets for 10 months talking about the extreme voices within our own society. And what we need to do is to have those common voices come together and talk. I think in your next session, you'll have some of those talks, people on the Palestinian side also who understand that. But the bulk of people on both sides right now don't want to reach out and talk to each other. So I'm not in an easy position to be able to find the commonalities at the moment.
And in terms of people on both sides of the conflict finding it difficult to reach out, which human nature is quite understandable. Obviously, there are a lot of external actors over the situation, whether that be Iran and its support for Hamas, or whether that be, as was discussed a few moments ago, the United States and its significant influence over what goes on. What is the, are those external forces part of the solution, or are they part of the problem? I suspect both, but I'd be interested to get your perspective on that.
So I'm going to do zoom in and zoom out. The Israeli-Palestinian conflict is one which has two sides with, at the end, between the river and the sea, and the term that's being used so often right now, are 15 million people. And in addition, you have diasporas and refugees that are outside that. So that's the zoom in when you're looking at that one. And all of these people in their different locations are impacted by the outer factors. As an Israeli, I look both at the Israeli-Palestinian conflict as one that needs to be resolved between these two people. That doesn't make it easy, but I am very impacted by the outer forces. I'm just going to say again right now that for me right now in the war that's going on, and it's a war of Israel against Hamas that is horrifically impacting not just in the Gaza Strip, and I'm very aware of that. But right now, as we're speaking today, this morning, throughout the day, Hezbollah is attacking deep inside Israel, and it's as if everybody's ignoring that as an outer force. Go into their website right now, the Al-Manal Hezbollah website. They state it clearly in a way that you won't necessarily hear, not even from Hamas right now, that call for our immediate destruction written in English so you'll be able to understand it. I listen to what the supreme leader of Iran says. I listen to the different voices of what we can call spoilers, but they are clear-cut forces that are in alignment with some of the forces within the Palestinian arena, certainly not with all of them. Palestinian Islamic Jihad is very much an Iranian proxy. It is not necessarily a large group. Hamas is very Palestinian. It's a clear-cut voice. I say, sadly, it calls for my annihilation. I thought until October 7th that there was the possibility to arrive there. As Professor Khalidi said before, if we don't talk to them, who else are we going to talk to? But I don't feel that I can talk to them right now. So when we look at those outer forces in its own way, don't we want to strengthen the voices that want to arrive at a resolution? That doesn't make it easy. That doesn't mean that we love each other and hug each other, but it does mean that in the Middle East right now, there are voices that acknowledge Israel. And it may be, Professor Khalidi, because of our strength, but they acknowledge our existence. And I want us to not just acknowledge Palestinian existence. This is something I give them as a something that it's about the right and something they deserve. But we have to have outer forces to strengthen the dialogue. And that's the kind of force that I want to see. I want to see the spoiler forces like Iran, like the proxies, like Syria for that matter, being sidelined, and the voices that call for a resolution to be the ones that are heightened also by the international community.
Thank you. Mr. Gorenberg, I think I saw you indicating trying to come in. Please, over to you.
You're on mute, I'm afraid.
Mute.
There's some background noise here, so I muted. I stress that public opinion on each side is also extremely volatile, and particularly during wartime. There are core groups on either side of public opinion that tend to remain fixed in their views. There's a large number of people whose views can shift with the circumstances. War tends to bring people to more hardline positions, and we see this not just in the current situation, but in polling figures from previous wars. The possibility of actually achieving an agreement tends to increase support for such an agreement. The most extreme example I can give you of this is what happened following the previous cataclysm of the 1973 war and its aftermath. Before Sadat's visit to Jerusalem, Sadat was talking about making peace with Israel, and Israeli polling showed that 85% of Israelis thought that he was not sincere in saying that. The week after his visit, a follow-up poll showed that 85% of Israelis thought that Sadat was sincere in seeking peace. The difference in these numbers, in my mind, is not connected to the specific symbolic act of the visit, but whether or not peace seems like a possibility. When it doesn't seem like a possibility, it's easiest to stress your absolute aspirations for everything. When it seems like you might be able to get a better future for yourself and your children, it's easier to consider compromises. So as utterly horrifying as the current situation is, I think that it's critical that people looking at it not be frozen in the picture of public opinion at this moment, but ask themselves what political moves can shift and change the balance of that opinion.
Dr. Khalidi, do you have any comments that you wanted to add?
Yeah, I would add a couple of things. The first is that if we want to create an atmosphere for anything better than what we're seeing, we have to stop this war. And the shilly-shallying and the dilly-dallying of the international community in this is frankly appalling. The fact that this war cannot be brought to an end by the countries that arm, and I don't expect Iran to end the war. I expect the United States to end the war. I expect the United Kingdom to help in that process. Stop the war, and you stop this tendency that has increased on both sides towards a more and more extreme view of the situation. That's the first thing I would say. This war should be stopped now. And obviously, prisoners and hostages should be released, and the starvation and the immiseration and the use of horrible means to cause famine in Gaza has to be ended. The United Kingdom has a fleet. The United States has a fleet. Why can't supplies be landed on the shores of Gaza? They have to be checked by Israel. They're coming from US or UK naval stores. This is a humanitarian catastrophe caused by Israel. It has to be ended. It has to be ended if you want to prevent people from becoming more extreme. The same thing is obviously happening in Israel. And ending the war would I think, help immeasurably towards bringing us to the kind of development that I agree with Gershom. That has happened in the past on both sides. If you look at how optimistic Palestinians were in the early 1990s, I was involved as an advisor to the Palestinian delegation in Washington and Madrid. Palestinians were extremely optimistic about the possibilities of peace and of a Palestinian state. I would argue they were prevented from having a Palestinian state. And that turned them in another direction. And that's why the Second Intifada was as brutal and as violent as it was, because Palestinians were convinced that they were not going to get what they had understood at the beginning of the 90s they were going to get. and they haven't had any hope, as far as I can tell, since the early 2000s, that the occupation would be ended, that this metastasizing settlement process would be stopped, or that the Palestinians would ever enjoy equal rights and sovereignty and statehood. And if you don't offer them that opportunity, of course people who advocate force as the only option are going to win out. That's why they've been winning out, because there has been no other option offered. And that's not only the fault of Israel, that's also the fault of the international community, and in my view also of failed Palestinian leadership.
Thank you, Dr. Richard. Bob.
Can I talk a little bit just about religion, because we've talked about secular national identity, although actually we haven't talked about Iranian identity, which I think is clearly part of this, maybe in relation to Hezbollah, less so maybe in relation to Hamas. But to what extent does religion, either on its own or as a marker of identity, play in the current but also the historic conflict between Israel and the Palestinians? Who wants to go first? Gershom, could you try that first?
Look, clearly religion is a major aspect of the conflict and a major piece of identity on each side, despite the strong secular elements in the history of both national movements. But I would also say that the division between religion and nationality, or national identity, is very difficult to make in some sort of stark, simple terms. Elements of Jewish religious identity remain even in the most secular perceptions of Israeli Jewish identity, and nationalism has become integrated in the religious identity of hardline extremists. The Jerusalem issue, which is one of the critical issues in the conflict, is one that is both a national and religious symbol on both sides. So this needs to be taken into account. It also needs to be understood that religion is itself not a static force. Religion has, in effect, become more extreme as a result of the national conflict. Religion has been reinterpreted as a hardline nationalist doctrine on each side, in my view. And under other circumstances and with the right encouragement, religion can be reinterpreted in a more moderate fashion. Religious traditions are storehouses of contradictions and of opposing texts. And when the mood is extreme, the most extreme text can be pulled out of the national attic or the religious attic and used to be proved that there is no possibility whatsoever of compromise. Under other circumstances, other texts can be pulled out. So one must not view the religious element ahistorically as a fixed issue. I would say that in any kind of discussions, it's extremely important to pay attention to the religious symbolism and meaning of particular issues for each side. For instance, trying to talk about Jerusalem without recognizing the symbolic importance of the holy places is a dead end. Okay. It's not just a dead end, it's disastrous.
When it comes to Israel, this is not fundamentally, one shouldn't interpret it as just Jews versus Muslims. Is that, do I understand that's correctly, what you're saying, does that also work for the dynamic between Israel and Iran?
I would say that is also true. Let me put it this way. I think that when one looks at Iran, it's the ideological element in the Iranian pursuit of greater power and hegemony in the region is obvious. But I think with a longer view of history, one must understand that Persia as a power in our region goes back far longer than the Islamic Revolution of 1979. Persian aspirations to reach the Mediterranean are much, much older than that. There is a tendency in modern discussion to only look at the ideology of the current players and not the long-term geopolitical interests. The Russians want a stakehold in the Mediterranean that preceded the fall of the Soviet Union and preceded the rise of the Soviet Union. Mm-hmm. Egypt, Persia, other powers in the region go back much further than our current ideological or religious conflicts, and one must take that into account.
It's a bit of a red herring, but do I understand? Do I remember correctly? I think Cyrus got quite a good write-up by the in the Old Testament, or am I misremembering? I thought he was a model for kingship amongst Jews at one point, wasn't he, the Persian king, a long time ago?
Yes, as a Persian king who had hegemony all the way to the Mediterranean.
He was the good guy for him. Okay. He was the one that we all love and talk about. It's called religious, having openness before we knew what that meant. Okay, can I jump in on one issue here?
Good for Cyrus. Sorry, can I bring in our other two? Sorry, good. Finished at that point.
I'm simply saying that even if the regime in Iran were to change overnight, its interest in what was going on in the region and its desire to affect that, the way that would be expressed would change, but the desire to do that are part of the facts of where Iran/Persia are located geopolitically.
Miri, would you like to add anything to this?
I'm going to add into this, and I'm doing an enormous zoom out. From Morocco through Iran, the different countries that we're talking about that are overwhelmingly Muslim in different types, both Sunni, both Shia, more religious, less religious, half the population is under the age of between 25 to 30, and that's vastly different from the Western world or from the UK, or for that matter, even Israel, even though we're an exception. And I say that because a country like Iran now is topping 90 million. A country like Turkey now is topping 90 million. We're talking about very populous countries. Turkey's Sunni, Iran has a Shiite majority. Again, they all have minorities. But I said that in the background because religion is an issue. Do you want to argue with somebody about religion, about the diversity of religion, about the different interpretations of religion? The 5 largest, most populous Muslim countries in the world are not in the Middle East. They're not Arabic speaking. They're in Asia for that degree, if it's Indonesia or India or Pakistan or Bangladesh or Nigeria. And then you get to Egypt. And I just say that in the background because when we talk about religion, the religious issue is in the conflict. And anytime something happens, if you call an event the Al-Quds or Al-Aqsa flood, okay, Tufan, if that's what you call it, and you say the words Al-Aqsa and you say the words Al-Quds, you're not just talking to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. You're not just talking to something which is local. You're making a statement which is going to touch the nerve of 2.2 billion Muslims in the world, and I understand that. But to me, that's part of the challenge. Israel took responsibility, took authority, conquered Jerusalem, applied Israeli law to Jerusalem, and Jerusalem is beyond the jewel in the crown. It could be, on the one hand, it's just this amazing aspect, but to say Jerusalem, Al-Quds, Al-Aqsa, the different terms, both in Arabic and in Hebrew, and Yerushalayim, to say them all together, the religion is in the room. We can't disconnect it. And it goes beyond the immediate conflict of Israeli-Palestinians and who gets the honor of being sovereign over the holy places. It's something that ignites the world. And Iran is the one that put together in this Islamic regime the Al-Quds Day, which the Shiite regime under Khomeini established in and around 1980-81. In upcoming Ramadan in the UK, the Al-Quds Day, which was instigated, and again, this isn't about the religious aspect. It was done as the last Friday of the month of Ramadan, no matter when that is, and it's a relatively new anniversary. And so it's in the religious realm of Ramadan. It's specifically the Al-Quds Jerusalem Day. It is now used as a very strong political element, both as a Palestinian political element worldwide, as a Muslim one against, again, the Israeli rule over Jerusalem. But I say that, don't ignore it. It's part of it. And it's a touchy one because it goes way beyond the immediate conflict of Israel-Palestine. It goes into the realm of belief, of religion, of Al-Quds, Jerusalem as a city, Yerushalayim. I mean, what do you do in that sense with that holy city, and who gets the honor to be sovereign there? So I jumped out all over the place in that one. Sorry.
Thank you very much. Do you want to?
Thank you so much.
So we hear a lot about possible...
Could I just say a couple of words here?
Go on.
Yeah,
We are starting to run out of
The
time.
only Muslim in the room?
Go on.
Yes, sorry, I should have done so. Apologies.
No, it's okay. A couple of things. First of all, of course, religion is important, and it's always been part of what's at stake here. These were largely secular national movements, but religion was always a part of them. But religion as an element in this war has increased on both sides as a result of the failure to end this conflict. If you go back and look at the role of religion, it played a role in 1929. It played a role at different other periods in history, but it has grown more and more and more important, especially in recent decades, as a result of a failure to end this conflict. And the international community, which helped to create this conflict, has an obligation to bring it down, to end it. And I don't think that obligation is seen as seriously as it should be, whether by the United States or by other countries. And the other thing I would say is for all of its exploitation of religion and all of the importance of religion to the Iranian regime, it's an Islamic republic after all. I see Iran as a state operating on the basis of raison d'etat, national interest. It's playing a game in the Middle East, which is, I don't think, really entirely or even largely driven by religion. It is obviously able to use religious tropes in different ways with its different allies all over the Muslim world. But this is a conflict which, if it can be ended in a just and sustainable manner, would remove any possibility of exploitation of it for religious purposes. And the last thing I want to say is about Jerusalem. The kind of creeping takeover which turned a mosque in Hebron into a place of Jewish worship and Muslim worship, the takeover of the Haram Ibrahim in decades past, is something that people see happening in the Haram al-Sharif, in the Al-Aqsa Mosque today. I was there less than a year ago, and the beginning of Jewish prayer there, which had never happened previously, is something that is an enormous provocation to Muslims worldwide. So yes, countries are stirring, Iran and other countries may be stirring this up on a religious basis. In my view, for entirely cynical raison d'etat reasons. But the way to deal with this is, first of all, to end this conflict, which the international community, since it helped to create it, has an obligation to do. And secondly, to stand up to the kind of moves that are being made systematically by Israeli governments to slowly but surely erode the protections for worship by Muslims and expand this area into a joint shared prayer area. We're not talking about the Kotel Plaza. We're not talking about areas of Jewish worship historically. We're talking about the Haram al-Sharif. We're talking about the area around the Dome of the Rock. That area has now become a contested area in religious terms, essentially because of actions taken by the Israeli government, this and earlier Israeli governments. And I don't see the international community saying or doing anything about this. If you want to stop religion from creating an even greater level of conflict, something should be done about this.
Thank you.
All right, thank you, Khalidi. I want to get through two more questions with you, but we're going to need very concise answers, please, on something that is very important. Henry, please.
So talking about a sustainable and stable future, we often hear about a two-state solution, but what are the thoughts of the panel about a three-state solution, about a confederation, about the West Bank returning to Jordan and Gaza returning to Egypt? Just looking to the future, be interested to get your perspectives on what that might look like.
Colonel Eisin.
So in Dr. Seuss sense, I'm going to say one state, two state, three state, four. So I said already before that two states is something that I would call a compromise, a historic compromise, not a happily ever after, but that historic compromise that I also support is because one state is either one Palestine, the Hamas version, I'm not alive then, I don't like that version. One state where Israel is the Jewish dominant force and the Palestinians are either second-class citizens or transported, as Professor Khalidi said before, and I oppose that completely. And as I am a very proud Zionist, and I think that the idea of having one Jewish nation state is as relevant in 2024 as it was from the 19th century and onward, you arrive at two states as the compromise, because one state is either not democratic and Jewish, or it is not Jewish. You lose that Zionist idea, or everybody's killing each other. And I think in that sense that the UK from the 1930s ruling here, the international community in 1947 as an idea, and the continuation of that two-state resolution is the one that stands. I don't think that it's, as I said, it's not happily ever after. Why three-state or four? Because the separation of the Gaza Strip from the Palestinian Authority in 2007, when Hamas took over from the Palestinian Authority, has posed us in this present situation where you have these two separate entities. I absolutely don't think that that's the end game, but I say it right now because I think that the Israeli policy over the last 15 years has very much been about separating the two, and it has definitely brought us, in that sense, the Israeli position further to where we are, where how do you put the Gaza Strip back into it? And I think that the Gaza Strip needs to be part of future Palestine. Egypt never wanted it, does not want it, will not want it in the future. Egypt did not allow in Palestinian refugees in 1948. They have built up right now several very big walls, not that you can't get over a wall, to make sure that no Palestinians could get there again. So it isn't about the Gaza Strip being part of Egypt. It never was. Egypt always separated it. But how do you arrive at getting back into a connection between the Gaza Strip and the West Bank, East Jerusalem as an area? I don't have the solution right now on hand. I think it is doable. Not right now. I agree with both Gershon and Professor Khalidi. This isn't something that we're too emotional about it right now, but it needs to be done. And how you do so, yes, you deal with Hamas, but you have to sideline in that sense to be able to bring them together. That's one state, two state, three state. Just to say that four state is an Israeli term that I've used, and that those extreme Messianic Jews who live in the West Bank and are part of the people who live in the West Bank, they certainly don't represent all of them, have stated themselves that they would like, they're going towards a Messianic Jewish state. That's not one I want to live in.
Dr. Khalidi.
Yeah, well, as Colonel Eisin said, Egypt does not want the Gaza Strip, never considered it part of its territory, and will not in the future, I would argue. And the same is true for Jordan. King Hussein separated Jordan from the West Bank, and I've not seen any indication that Jordan would, under any circumstances, accept to take the West Bank or any other part of what was mandatory Palestine. So that's not in the cards. I personally feel that whether we're talking about a one-state or a two-state or a confederal or a cantonal solution, the most important thing is that everybody have absolutely equal rights, that national rights, political rights, civil rights, religious rights of everybody be respected, and that they have equal rights. The last thing I will say, and I won't, you have another session, I know, is that anyone who talks to me about a two-state solution has to talk to me about ending the occupation and removing the settlements that were created to prevent a two-state solution. Two-state solution would oblige the Palestinians to accept 22% of their ancestral homeland. If 60% of that is taken up by settlements, you're not talking about a two-state solution. And if you're not ending occupation and ending Israeli security control, which this government has said it wants to extend indefinitely, and which every previous government, going back to Rabin, has said that they would continue, you're not talking about a state. You're talking about a Bantustan, an Indian reservation. You can describe it as you will. You're talking about a one state and one Bantustan solution. You have to end the occupation. And people don't talk about that. And people don't talk about settlements when they talk about two-state solution. This airy, fairy discussion of two states doesn't come to grips with the reasons that we don't have a two-state solution. And that's because you have 70,000 Israeli settlers. That's because you have a permanent occupation, a 56-year occupation. 3 generations of Palestinians have grown up under it. I could go on about what you would need to do to have a just two-state solution or a just one-state solution. The basic absolute necessity is equal rights for everybody. If the solution does not embody that, it will not be sustainable, it will not last, it won't be just.
Thank you.
Bring Gorenberg for the last word.
Yes, Mr.
You're on
Gorenberg.
mute, Mr. Gorenberg.
There's been a lot of background noise here. The comments about Jordan and Egypt, I agree completely with what my colleague said. I don't think, I agree with Colonel Eisin that the proposal of one state is a proposal for a continued conflict. It not only, the one state idea solves the issue of borders and leaves all the other issues, including settlements, holy places, refugees, etc., to supposedly be worked out by a government in which Jews and Palestinians are virtually equal. That is not a proposal for an end to the conflict, but for a proposal for continuing the conflict in a different form. A two-state agreement, in fact, requires the end of the occupation. I've already commented on the fact that I think that, difficult as it would be to return settlers to the state of Israel, it is a realistic possibility and one that should not be seen as the absolute hurdle to a two-state outcome. Finally, regarding the idea of a confederation is an agreement between two sovereign states. The EU is a confederation. The confederation is not an alternative to a two-state agreement, but a variation upon it. Perhaps a very positive variation upon it, but it cannot be discussed as being something other than a two-state outcome. So what we need to talk about are the means, including international involvement, security arrangements, return of settlers that would bring about a two-state agreement. That, in fact, provides for the realization of the individual, but also the national rights of both peoples.
Thank you.
I had two more questions I wanted to ask myself, but we are going to have to wrap up. So thank you all ever so much for giving them to us. We are very grateful for your time. Obviously, this inquiry will continue. We're now going to move to our second panel. So can all those who are online please switch on their videos, and those who are leaving us either log off or switch off your videos, please. But thank you all ever so much for your time today.
Thanks for having us.
No, it's quite all right. Just before we quickly kick off, Gershon, can I check that we can hear you?
Yes, you can hear me. I can hear you, I hope.
Perfect. As loud as you can be, the better. And
okay.
then there we go. And Samer, can we check we can hear you?
Well, good afternoon. I can hear you very well.
Perfect. And Alistair, welcome as well. I'm going to ask you all to just give a quick 20-second introductions of yourselves, and then we'll go straight into questions as we're still live. So Gershon, if you can kindly introduce yourself.
Dr. Gershom Baskin. I'm currently working for the British UK, the UK NGO called International Communities Organization. We work in conflict zones with failed peace processes, so I'm very much in the right place.
Samer.
Sinijlawi, I'm a Palestinian political activist from East Jerusalem and the chairman of Jerusalem Development Fund.
Robert and Samer, I'm definitely going to ask you to speak as loudly as you can, just so we don't miss a word. Alistair.
Alistair Burt, former Member of Parliament in the UK, Minister for the Middle East for 5 years on and off between 2010 and 2019. Still engaged in travelling and talking about the region and working with a number of NGOs there.
Great. Well, we're grateful to have all three of you, as we know this is about focusing on what we can do going forward. Royston, please.
Thank you, Chairman. To kick off with you, Alistair, if I may. How far do you think the Abraham Accords and perhaps the potential for Saudi-Israel normalisation have improved the prospects of a resolution in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict?
There were positive aspects to the Abraham Accords and other aspects. The positive ones were they gave a projection of a Middle East that could look different. A Middle East in which Israel was plugged in firmly, part of a new economic region, very much to the benefit of both Israel, the Gulf states that were engaged with it. And it gave a sense that the Middle East could move on. There was also a security aspect to it in relation to the Gulf states' relationship with Israel, which had been going on for many years, but not necessarily as public as it became. However, it was not the answer for two reasons. Firstly, and mainly, it ignored the Palestinian issue. it gave a sense that the future of the region could be sorted without dealing with the Palestinian issue. That did a couple of things. In Israel, it reinforced a view amongst certain Israeli politicians that they'd been right all along. The Palestinian issue was marginal. It could be put to one side. It could be managed and controlled, and they would have a good relationship with Arab states regardless. So it gave sense to that. For Palestinians, it looked as though this was another abandonment, and this was an abandonment by those immediately around them. It was part of President Trump's desire to create the deal of the century, to sort it all out. I remember going to see Jason Greenblatt on a number of occasions as they were negotiating about the deal of the century, and I always told him three things. Firstly, don't humiliate the Palestinians when you produce the deal. Secondly, make sure there's something for us to work on. We know it will lean more towards Israel than other the Palestinians, but leave us something to work on. And thirdly, don't think this can all be solved by a check. It's not all about money. And I think to a certain extent the good things of the Abraham Accords showed the way forward. And if only there was more leverage used in the compiling of the Accords and then afterwards by the states who obviously want a relationship with Israel. And that Saudi relationship that you mentioned could be absolutely fundamental. But the Saudis had always made it clear that the Palestinian issue had to be an element of it. It seemed to me it waxed and waned a bit. Sometimes it was very important, sometimes it was slightly less important. But now it's clear that any future normalisation between Israel and the neighbouring states, the Palestinian issue now has to be part of the resolution. And that, I think, is a good thing.
Do you think and for all three of you, but I'll go to you first, Alistair, since you started, do you think that the October the 7th massacre has, and the subsequent war, of course, awful, terrible war that we're seeing unfold, do you think that's made a two-state solution more or less achievable? I know that, before we start, I know that there are people in Palestine, in the West Bank and elsewhere, who are saying that a two-state solution is no longer the solution.
No, I would think it's quite the opposite. I think it's very clear that while the two-state solution over the past years was thought by many, including myself, to no longer be viable, the October war has brought the two-state solution back to the international table, to the Israeli and Palestinian table as well, even though it's very difficult for Israelis and Palestinians to confront it because we're dealing with two traumatized people. But what is clearer than ever is that while the Israeli-Palestinian conflict was generally thought that it needed to be resolved between the Israelis and the Palestinians alone, it was always said they have to want it more than us being the international community. That's no longer the case. This war, as we have seen, has gone beyond the borders of Israel and Palestine, and it affects regional security and international shipping and global security in general. So I think that the international community, and essentially what you're doing here today in Parliament, is a very, very important step in the right direction of understanding the international dimensions of this conflict and the urgency of bringing it to a resolution, which has not been the case in the last years. The two-state solution is back up front and center, and there probably is no other credible resolution to this conflict.
Sam, do you want to go next?
Well, I think we need to learn something from the Abraham Accords and from the experiences of the United Arab Emirates. More important, if we are here checking the possibilities of the Saudi to come on board, and especially now after the crisis of the 7th October and the war in Gaza, the Saudis are becoming the rescue boat for both Israelis and Palestinians. It is maybe the exit out of this war, because they are the ones who will be able to motivate Israelis to go into a major political breakthrough, including the Palestinians. They are the ones that can take a lot of part in the reconstruction of Gaza, and they are also able to create some kind of Arab-Palestinian arrangements that will unlock the necessity of creating security arrangements that will satisfy the Israelis to be able to withdraw. But We need to listen carefully to what the Saudis say. And we need to believe what they say. They say that without a clear recognition of a Palestinian state on the borders of 67 with East Jerusalem as a capital, they are not interested to be part of any kind of process. This is their condition, not only because of it is based on the Arab Peace Initiative, but also because after the war on Gaza, it's becoming a domestic issue. It is a very sensitive issue among the Saudi public. I think if the 7th October and the war could be seen as either has distanced us from a political breakthrough or brought us closer, depends on how major influential Western power will react, especially UK and USA. And I think there is only one tool now that can help into bringing the Saudi or bringing the region into a more dynamics of expanding the Abraham Accords, which is recognizing the Palestinian state. And this could save the two-state solution by a critical mass recognition of the state of Palestine, especially by the UK and USA. And this will turn the current breakdown into a breakthrough towards peace. This recognition can't be more easy than straightforward, since that the state of Palestine designates territory and population and significant international recognition, which fulfills attributes of statehood according to the international law. In fact, now, today, we have 30 countries that have diplomatic missions in Ramallah, and more than 130 states recognize the state of Palestine. The UN recognized the state of Palestine as a non-member observer state. But UK needs to do this right. And I suggest the following recommendation. First, UK and USA, of course, should not condition this recognition to Israel's consent. Second, they should keep the borders of the state of Palestine to be determined in negotiation based on the United Nations Security Council Resolution 242. And third, this recognition should come into concrete steps, including inviting the state of Palestine to establish an embassy in London and transforming the Consulate General of UK in East Jerusalem to be the embassy of Palestine. This is very important to help dynamics that will create a possibility now to end the war and end this conflict forever, because it has been proven that this conflict cannot be managed, and it has been proven that any peace, development, and normalization among Arab or Muslim states with Israel without having the Palestinian element solved will not bring any peace or security to the Israelis and will not fulfill the national aspirations for Palestinians.
Thank you. Let me go back and concentrate a bit on the impact of October the 7th on a potential solution. Firstly, I take the view, which has come from talking to so many people in the region, October the 7th has changed everything. There is no going back to October the 6th. There is no going back to a situation of faux status quo where the situation could be managed and would just drift on. No Arab state is going to put money into rebuilding Gaza if it's going to be destroyed again in 2 or 3 years with a further outbreak of the conflict. And no one that I've spoken to can see a possibility of resolving the issues in Gaza without also including West Bank, occupation, East Jerusalem and Jerusalem. So it's absolutely, as Gershon said, something that had indeed slipped down the agenda is now back on the agenda. It's absolutely true to say that over the years, when a point has been reached that it's just too difficult to go on, people haven't gone on. And it was inevitable that sooner or later something catastrophic would happen, and people have been warning about it for years. Looking back over my notes, I was talking about urgency in 2011 when I was making visits to Israel and to the occupied territories. We all knew it was underlying, but it did slip down everybody's agenda, including that of the Arab states. And the awfulness of October the 7th has changed everything, I think. So if it has changed everything, then what are the ways forward, of which I've always believed that two-state has the best opportunity in the absence of anything else. But before we go on, and I'm sure you want to explore that, I would just say I think it's very easy here not to fully understand the degree of trauma that is affecting both Israel and Gaza. The degree of trauma in Israel is immense, talking to friends there. People can barely think about anything but security. This is not the time that rational decisions are going to be made about the long-term future, which means other people have to be involved in that process. The same in Gaza, for obvious reasons, as we see happening every day. But also in this country, we mustn't underestimate either the impact on the Arab world, which has been immense. There is only one narrative in the Arab world, and it's not about October the 7th, it's about occupation. It's very clear. And therefore, the idea of resolving this in some artificial way, we sort of manage Gaza and we go on, is impossible. So that throws up, out of all these awful circumstances, the opportunity finally to do something, not to turn away when it's too difficult. And I think that opens up new opportunities for the United Kingdom, for friends, both of Israel and the Palestinians and the Arab world, to reach the conclusion that we haven't been able to do in the past and to play a part. It's not for us to decide. This must be determination by Israelis and Palestinians themselves. Friends have failed in the past, but maybe this time we can help.
Bob, and then just the panel, I am desperately aware of the lack of nuance and detail and discussions around this. But I am also aware we have a lot of questions we want to ask you today, so I am going to ask for, if possible, nuanced, short answers. But Bob, over to you, please.
Nuanced and short.
I know. I recognise I'm testing.
For a stern
Bob,
chair.
Just for Summer and for Alistair, just a quick question. I understand, I completely understand, accept the argument that the two-state solution is back on the agenda, in part because of the horribleness of what has happened. The argument is that if you then recognise if you recognise a Palestinian state now, effectively you're reacting to Hamas's violence, and therefore diplomatically now is not the time to recognise a Palestinian state. Can I just ask Summer what he would say to that, and then afterwards, Alistair, what you would say to that?
Well, I have been facing this argument from lots of Israelis, and my answer to this is as follows. When you recognize a Palestinian state now, you don't give a prize to Hamas, because Hamas doesn't have a two-state solution on its agenda. You are giving a prize to moderate Palestinians, just like me, who are ready to live in coexistence with Israel side by side. So it's very wrong conclusion that recognizing the Palestinian state is giving a prize to Hamas. Okay. I think Hamas has a different agenda.
Okay, and Samad, thank you. That's a really great short answer. Just very, very quickly on that. If you do it with the prize that you want, isn't that going to damage the UK? It's badly damage the UK's relationship with Israel, which is clearly important to this country.
Well, then you need to decide if you really support the two-state solution. You need to take some steps into it, because now we have a short window time. If the train leaves the station of the two-state solution, it will be too late. Okay. All of us now in this room and every policymaker in the world, we can be either the ones who have signed the death certificate of the two-state solution, or we will be the one who have saved it and signed the birth certificate of the two-state solution. It's now or never forever.
Okay, Alistair?
The Hamas attack of October the 7th was not in pursuit of the Palestinian state. It was an act of terror, and it was to pursue its ideology of the elimination of Jews. Recognising a Palestinian state is not connected with that in any way, and I entirely agree with what Samir said.
So you do it sooner rather than later? You do it now?
No, that wasn't your question. What David Cameron has done has changed the nature of a potential recognition. Mm-hmm. It had always been assumed that recognition would come towards the end of a negotiated process. Okay. In effect, that put the power in the hands of those who were negotiating, and I put it to you, particularly those who didn't want a Palestinian state at all. if you make sure your negotiations aren't going to end, you're never going to get the recognition of a Palestinian state.
So
and
Hamas
clearly some Israeli politicians wanted that.
Right, so Hamas and the Netanyahu government, effectively.
Hamas I don't consider as a state entity to take part in negotiations such as this.
There's two people who don't want a two-state solution. Hamas, who want the destruction of Israel.
And certain elements in Israel.
And the Netanyahu government.
That is right. So bringing the potential of recognition at an earlier stage in the process as a catalyst rather than a conclusion changes the nature of how that decision would be made and what would follow from it.
Thank you.
Gershom.
Yeah, I wanted to respond to the notion that this would be a prize for Hamas. In fact, if we want to defeat Hamas, Hamas can be defeated militarily, and perhaps Israel can ensure that Hamas cannot govern in Gaza. But defeating the idea and the ideology of Hamas is done by making Palestine real for Palestinians. Palestinians need to understand that they can begin to live for Palestine and they don't need to die as martyrs for Palestine. And that is done through the recognition of the state of Palestine. Let's not forget there are, as Samer said, 139 nations in the world that have recognized the state of Palestine. With the exception of Sweden, none of the OECD nations have done it. And it is time to take yourselves seriously. You have talked about a two-state solution for 30 years. It is time to remove Israel's veto on the question of statehood. This should not be an Israeli decision. It should be a decision of the international community. I would, in order to counter Israeli claims that this is against Israel, that I would, at the same time as recognizing the state Palestine, call on the nations of the world who have yet to recognize the state of Israel to do so. I believe that there are 160 or 166 countries of the 193 member states of the United Nations that have recognized the state of Israel, but there are states that haven't. So while Britain goes ahead and recognizes Palestine, which should be done now, it shouldn't be postponed. We shouldn't talk about some imaginary path to statehood. Palestinians have to know that statehood is being taken real, and the Israelis are going to be challenged on the need to roll back the occupation, but at the same time call on the states that haven't recognized Israel to do so as well.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Henry.
In terms of preparing for a two-state solution now, what realistically needs to happen is an end to the settlements in the West Bank and indeed settlers, Israeli settlers leaving those places in the West Bank, and also in terms of the other challenge, who should be representing the Palestinian state? We've already heard that it's can't be Hamas, but who, in your opinions, should be doing that? Dr. Baskin, maybe if I could come to you first.
Sure. First, I think it's important to realize that Prime Minister Netanyahu's days are numbered. It's not tomorrow, maybe not the day after tomorrow, but we are at the end of the Netanyahu era, and Netanyahu's ability to block the future negotiations between Israel and the Palestinians and the other Arab states is going to end sooner rather than later. There will be mass demonstrations as soon as there's a serious pause in the war calling for new elections in Israel. It's already beginning. The current Palestinian Authority government has resigned. Samer will speak to the need to push President Abbas to the side to be a ceremonial president. The Palestinians need representative leadership that's acceptable in the West Bank and Gaza. That's their decision, and they will make those choices, but there will eventually be a need for elections there. Negotiations need to take place in the future on a regional basis, not a bilateral Israeli-Palestinian basis. The table is too unbalanced for that. We need a regional architecture for security, stability, economic development. It must include Israel and Egypt and Jordan and the Emirates and Bahrain, and especially the Saudis. And this will be the framework for future negotiations between the state of Israel and the state of Palestine. Negotiations which are based of two member states of the United Nations, with one member state of the United Nations occupying another. That automatically changes the parameters and the dynamics of those negotiations, which have been until now between a recognized state and a disputed territory. It's not a disputed territory. It will be the state of Palestine. The borders will have to be determined in negotiations, but Palestine must be on an equal footing in terms of statehood in order to produce a successful negotiation.
Thank you.
No? Very quick question for you, Samer. Does Palestine need essentially a Mandela figure? You know, we've got the likes of Marwan Barghouti, Nasser Al-Kidwa, Mohammed Kwala. I apologise, I have mispronounced all their names, which I apologise sincerely. But does it need a unifying figure who can essentially realise Palestinian aspirations? And given the resignation of the Prime Minister and the PA, are we further away from that than ever before?
Well, I guess it's clear that the Palestinians has showed in all the recent polls in the last 10 years that 90% of the Palestinians would like to see President Mahmoud Abbas leaving the political life. They consider the current regime in the West Bank as a corrupt regime. They accuse the current regime of President Abbas as one that violates human rights. And he has cancelled the Legislative Council, he has controlled the judicial system. So there is a lot of criticism from the Palestinian side. Unfortunately, the elections that were fixed for 2021 were cancelled also. So now it's not time for elections, because Gaza will not be able now to participate in any national elections until we bring back life to Gaza. We need to find a way in which we allow Mr. Abbas to transfer himself into an honorable president, ceremonial president, just like the president in Israel or Italy or Germany, and hand over all his power to a prime minister that can form a government that can unify Palestinians geographically and also all the functions. And this is possible, but he will not do it voluntarily. It needs some kind of pressure. It is not only a Palestinian internal issue. I think it is now a regional and international issue. And we expect that donors, those who are now studying the possibility of recognizing the state of Palestine, could do some kind of diplomacy into this direction. There are a lot of names that can unify the Palestinian. You have mentioned some of them, Dr. Nasser Qudwa, Mohammed Dahlan. Although Mohammed Dahlan doesn't want to take any position, but he can help a lot. Dr. Nasser Qudwa is a diplomat. He's from Fatah. He is accepted by the street in the West Bank and in Gaza. He can be the perfect person to form such a government. Unfortunately,
it's also the nephew of Yasser Arafat. Don't forget, Samer. The nephew of Yasser Arafat is also symbolic.
Yeah.
Yes. The news yesterday about the resignation of the government of Mohammed Shtayyeh and the expectation that President Abbas will ask Mohammed Mustafa, Dr. Mohammed Mustafa, to form a new government. This is cosmetic change that will not be satisfying nor the Palestinian street in the West Bank and Gaza, neither the international community. So it should be serious changes that can give the Palestinians a hope that now they can replace the corruption in the West Bank and the destruction in Gaza into a path of construction.
Very helpful. Please, Alistair.
We were asking about the steps to the two-state negotiations. Could I first say in answer to your question, for there to be a Mandela, there has to be a de Klerk, and we don't see that either. In relation to the steps to the two-state, I've argued or put to the Foreign Office over the past few months a sense, which I'm sure shared by everybody, there needs to be a series of parallel conversations going on. First and foremost, you've got to end the conflict, as Samir and Gershon have said. You end the conflict, you return the hostages. Secondly, you've got to consider what will happen to Gaza the day after. Everybody we've spoken to in the region says in order to deal with the day after in Gaza, you've got to have a horizon which is longer term, because that's the way to get the agreements you need on Gaza. Thirdly, you have the discussion about the longer-term future of Gaza, not just the immediate authority, but the longer term. And that has to be, fourthly, as part of the overall settlement, which will involve West Bank, East Jerusalem, as well as Gaza. These can't be sequential because we don't have the time. They've got to be parallel. The talks on all these things need to be going on now because they're all equally important, but of course the most immediate is the conflict. But that's why the conversations need to be taking place at the same time. The international community clearly has a role. The friends in the region are vital, as both Gershon and Samir have made clear. There is a role for Western states who should be involved. I think the United Kingdom has a serious convening role to play and should be doing so. I think it needs a lot of envoys, a lot of people working on it at the same time with a common purpose. But those are the steps. And as part of that, the overall settlement, the overall resolution, which may be a two-state or something different, that clearly has to be part of it. But it can no longer be a veto to dealing with the other conversations. The last point I would make is don't neglect civil society either. Civil society should play a large part in this. We were the first government to recognise something called the International Fund for Israeli-Palestinian Peace in 2018. That's got a lot of support, and there are groups. Remember, 20% of the population of Israel are Arab Israelis. And one of the things that hasn't happened post-October the 7th has been the intercommunal violence that we saw in 2021. There are those living together in those communities, self-policing at the moment to make sure there's no trouble. So I hear from people in the area. And when people are trying to make out nobody can live with each other anymore, that's blatantly not true for those who are living together. So that field, civil society, the work of ULMET, the Alliance for Middle East Peace, and those who work in that sort of area. There is something called the Arab Initiative. It's not the Arab Accords, it's the Abraham Accords, it's the Abraham Initiative, people working together. Civil society should play a part in this, and that needs to be parallel with the political negotiations. But those opportunities are there, and this time we mustn't miss them.
Thank you. I know Fabian actually wants to pick up exactly that issue with you, so please.
Yes, if I may, and thank you, Chair. Gershon, good to see you again. It's a while since we last met here in the Houses of Parliament. And that reminded me that 20 years ago we were sitting in this room, almost having the same conversation, with one difference. We didn't have the horrors of what's going on today in Gaza. So what I wanted to ask you all, first of all, is if there is a two-state solution, Israel and Palestine living together, how do you think conflict could be prevented between them? I mean, is it realistic to suggest that a state of Palestine should be demilitarized? And if so, how can it really be independent? And what about an international peacekeeping force at the start? But we know that that actually hasn't succeeded. It's failed more than once. What would be different this time? How can we actually achieve what I think everybody in this room wants to see and which you've all put to us so clearly and so articulately? Gershon, do you want to come in first?
Sure. I think, first of all, we start with what Samer said, in that there needs to be a legitimate and accepted Palestinian governance in Gaza and in the West Bank, replacing what currently exists. And that government would be inviting a multinational Arab-led force to Gaza. We have indications that several of the Arab nations would agree to come in if they are invited by the Palestinians. They would need, of course, a limited mandate, 1 or 2 years maximum, during which time they would help to create stability and security. It would also be what would enable Israel to withdraw from Gaza, and that has to happen, because the longer that Israel stays in Gaza, the more we can be 100% sure that there will be armed insurgency. On the question of a demilitarized Palestinian state, in all negotiations that have taken place between Israel and the PLO over the last 30 years, the Palestinians accepted the idea of a non-militarized Palestinian state. They would have an effective police force. They would need to deal with issues of terrorism. They would cooperate with Israeli intelligence. But it would not be a militarized state in the sense of having an army with offensive capabilities. I think this is acceptable to most Palestinian negotiators, and it can be explained to the Palestinian public as well. There's essentially no one to defend themselves against with an army. And as the late Faisal Husseini used to say, it would be a waste of our resources to spend it on a Palestinian tank when we really need to put our resources into developing a Palestinian computer. I think that we will need some kind of international third-party roles along the Jordan River, perhaps on both sides of the Jordan River, along the border between Gaza and Israel and Gaza and Egypt, And we can talk about different kinds of forces that are there. They are going to have to be temporary, because at the end, the Israelis and the Palestinians have to provide security for each other. If Israel doesn't allow the Palestinians to have freedom and dignity, Israel won't have security. And if the Palestinians don't allow Israel to have security, they won't have freedom and dignity. That's the basic bottom line here. I would lastly say that when we do negotiate, we're going to have to do it very differently than we did in the past. There have to be negotiations both on the lack of trust, because we signed 6 agreements in the past and breached all of those agreements. So we're going to need benchmarked agreements that will be determined by third-party monitors and verifiers, very much of the kind that existed during the arms control talks between the US and the USSR, where third parties played a role in monitoring and verifying the implementation of agreements. We have a history of not implementing our commitments, and we can't allow that to happen again. So we will need trusted third parties to play that monitoring and verifying role before we are required to take additional steps that are dangerous and risk our security. We need to learn from the lessons of the past. By the way, I've written extensively on this. There's a book I was told I could mention called In Pursuit of Peace in Israel and Palestine, published by Vanderbilt University Press, which is available, and it basically contains 38 years of insights and lessons learned from the failure of the Israeli-Palestinian peace process.
Samir.
Well, I think it's a very complicated issue. And let me start by saying that it's a matter of urgency, that now we can create a mechanism of security arrangements inside Gaza and on the borders with Israel to allow this war stop. And for us, it's so urgent. Each hour counts, because currently we have 200 victims a day in Gaza. A child is killed every 6 minutes in Gaza. So on the Palestinian side, we need to see an end to this as soon as possible. And without providing some security arrangements that convince the Israeli to withdraw, we are not going to be there. The only way is that a reputable, acceptable Palestinian political body, government, that is accepted by the Palestinian state, by the Palestinian state, and by those donors and countries like Saudi Arabia, calls and asks for an Arab force to come at the beginning to take the keys of Gaza gradually from the Israelis and then deliver it to the new government. And within this process, we can create a mechanism of security that can guarantee and satisfy the security needs of Israel. And it is very simply, the 7th of October wouldn't have happened if there was 30 tanks, Israeli tanks, on the borders with Gaza, and some Apache helicopters. There was no army there. So in a way or another, everybody learned some lessons from the 7th of October. The Israelis can take their security arrangements, in addition to the Arab force on the other side of the borders. More important, if the Palestinians start feeling a hope that is coming to them, a light at the end of the tunnel, then the dynamics, the depression among Palestinians, that is the weather for violence, will disappear. We need also to work very hard on the education system on both sides, and we need to fight incitement, that it exists both on the Palestinian and Israeli side. We need also to work very good on the media. The media always shows the bad side of the opponent. We need to start making good tools inside the media that shows the good side of the opponent. So there is a lot of things that needs to happen, but what's most urgent now is that we can create the mechanism where the Israelis are happy to withdraw from Gaza and stop a catastrophe there of starvation, of health problems. And this needs to be done immediately, now, not tomorrow.
Thank you very much. Alistair, great to see you. Do you think that in this hopefully not hypothetical, soon to be real two-state solution, that Palestinians will feel secure if they are demilitarized? And would that be an opportunity for the Israelis to not demilitarize, but at least to tone down some of their immense force that they have?
I think, Fabian, we're some way from that. I mean, remember Miri's comments in the session that we've just heard. I think, as far as I'm concerned, she described accurately that sense at the end of the day, Jews feel alone. Who stands with them? Who's going to provide their security if they do not themselves? I think at this stage it's asking a great deal to get to the answer of that question of easing their defences or changing anything. Of course, ultimately, security comes from the fact that you do not believe your neighbour is going to threaten you. And that's when most of us feel secure, and that's what's happened in Europe, at least until very recently, which is changing our perspective on things. But that's the heart of it. But we're nowhere near the confidence at that stage. But I think the central point of your question about how people feel secure and the importance of it was answered by both colleagues in recognising that both Palestinians and Israelis have a vested interest in each other's security. I remember I wrote to the Foreign Secretary when he was appointed, and one of the things I said to him, we should be aiming for this. There's no justice or security for Palestine without security for Israel, and no security for Israel without justice and security for Palestine. And ultimately, each must be as convicted of the need to deliver for the other as for themselves, for they cannot have what they wish for unless the others have what they wish for also. And that's the key. It's getting that sense of confidence that what I want for myself is good for you, and what you want for me is good for you too. And that is a build-up of trust over a period of time, and that's what many people have to work with. But ultimately, that's where you want to get to. I think the external threat is still there for both. I think Israel needs to, as long as there are states talking about the destruction of the state of Israel, they're going to want to be protected, and they're entitled to feel that. And equally, I think also the dangers from within. Extremists who exploit. We haven't explored the risks and dangers of what may happen in Jerusalem yet, but certainly Palestinian politics can be destabilised by extremists who will say that they haven't got the horizon, the hope that Samir spoke of, and until that's dealt with, then the risk of extremism and violence within is there as a threat to security. So I go back to what I said earlier. There's several things to be discussed in parallel.
Very briefly, is it true to suggest that for many, many decades, that it is, or certainly the last 20 years, that the extremes in both Israel and in Palestine have dictated the agenda for the more moderate elements? Yes or no?
I think the evidence would suggest the answer is yes on both counts. Israeli politics has got more extreme. The elections of November 2022 demonstrated that, and the addition in cabinet of those who are extreme and indeed Jewish supremacists to a degree of risks. The fact that Judea and Samaria, some would say that Judea and Samaria are at war with the state of Israel. There's that extremism, and we've seen what's happened in relation to Hamas, and also the rise in support for Hamas in the Arab world, because they are seen to be the resistors, and the Palestinian authorities' sense amongst Palestinians has waned because the Palestinian Authority has not been seen as being able to protect Palestinians from the IDF or from the settlers. So the rise in extremism in all different elements of this have helped to create the awful circumstances in which we have now, but then also the opportunity finally to deal with it, because things can't go on as they are for the people who are suffering most, the victims on all sides.
So can I take you back then to something you said to Fabian? So you're talking about two-state solutions, but you said earlier about how it's miraculous that essentially we haven't seen conflict within communities within Israel, given the fact that 20% of the community are of Arab background. Lots of people lost faith in the concept of a one-state solution before October 7th. As you say, October 7th does change everything. But essentially, how would we have long-term a state where you don't see conflict? And actually, a lot of the people we heard speaking to us about a one-state solution were Palestinians, young Palestinians, saying to us, we've given up hope on the idea of a two-state solution. How would you have, in the long term, a state where you didn't see essentially mass civil war within a one state?
I don't know, Chair, to be honest. That's why I've always tended to believe that a two-state was more likely, because I wasn't sure I could see a one-state solution that would satisfy both the state and nationalistic aspirations of the Palestinian people and the civil rights of the Palestinian people, and yet at the same time deliver a Jewish democratic state for the Israeli Jewish population. I couldn't see how both could be worked out. A state in which everybody has the same rights, I cannot see the present structure of Jewish Israel feeling safe or secure with that. And that's why the two states might have been a better answer. But from what we know about what's going on inside Israel at the moment, there are the things that we spoke of. Whether or not that could be a national movement, I'm not close enough to say. We have two more experts than me in relation to that.
Samir, please.
Well, let me tell you something, and I really know Palestinians very well. I know Israelis very well. If the two-state solution will not be activated, implemented, before the end of this year, you should say goodbye to this option. The younger generations of the Palestinians think more into the one-state option. We have a limited time window, and we have this current political elite generation that is able to negotiate and settle into a two-state solution. Most of the Palestinians would welcome two-state solution and would welcome one-state equal rights solution. What they refuse is the current two-floor state solution, in which the Israelis are in the noble floor and the Palestinians are in the servant floor. This cannot continue, and it's a matter of urgency. I am 52 years old. I was born in Jerusalem, and until now I am not a citizen of any state. Israel is not guaranteeing me citizenship, and Israel is preventing creating a Palestinian state where I can be a citizen. And it's a basic right for any human being in the world to be a citizen of at least one state. So this is an urgent issue, and it should be addressed with a lot of responsibility from the international community, especially the UK, in relation to the long history of involvement of the UK into Palestine-Israel.
No. Gershom.
Right, I think that the one-state democratic option is perhaps the utopian solution, but we live very far away from utopia. We've been killing each other for more than 100 years over a territorial expression of our identity in which both people claim the same territory and claim that they give their identity to that territory and take their identity from it. And the international community is determined over and over again that the best way of moving forward is through partition, is through a two-state solution. I've always believed that the best road to a one-state solution is through a two-state solution where we have decades of peace and normalcy without conflict, and then perhaps we can begin to drop borders. But we need to imagine a two-state solution which is built on bridges and cooperations, and not two states which are built on fence and walls that separate contact between people. We need to be very clear when we talk about two-state solution. We're talking about reaching two states like in Europe that live side by side and trade with each other and share research and economy and education, etc. So the two-state solution vision needs to be one that provides hope for people, one that provides opportunities for movement and social upward movement and interaction. Israelis and Palestinians need to learn each other's language, their sister languages. We need to have active programs, as Alistair said, in civil society that are building bridges between these communities. And the last thing is really important to say is I think that we all have to take ourselves a lot more seriously. We've been talking about two states. We've been talking about the illegality of Israeli settlements. We need to turn those statements that we believe in into action. The occupation needs to be rolled back. There are solutions for dealing with 75 to 80% of the settlements by annexing part of the territory and doing land swaps on a one-to-one basis. There are ways to deal with the future of Jerusalem because it's a very segregated city. There are ways of dealing with the holy places. This has been mapped out. It's been worked on through 20 years of negotiations in track 1 and track 2. In fact, I would propose as a document that we encouraged former Prime Minister Olmert to draft, which concluded where his negotiations with President Abbas led to and what it would take to close those negotiations. We've shared that document both with President Abbas and a number of other Palestinian leaders, and we find very broad acceptance of the ideas that are presented there. It's a very short paper that I will send to the committee that you could perhaps consider making part of your report to the government. I think it's worthwhile looking at this framework as issues that are resolvable.
And just there, I am going to take us back to Jerusalem before we finish the session, but Gershon, just on the state of Israeli politics right now, does it really allow for a two-state solution, or are we doing what I think is happening in whispered diplomatic corridors, talking about a post-Netanyahu two-state solution? You know, where are we?
We're talking about a post-Netanyahu situation, and probably a post-Mahmoud Abbas situation as well. There will be changes on both sides. I think it's very important to mention that when the Palestinians eventually refine their election law, they are going to need and adopt a clause that will not allow political parties that support the armed struggle to participate in those elections, because in a state there's one sovereign and one gun, and you can have multiple militias. And I think that Israel has gone through political upheavals. We saw 40 months of massive demonstrations, hundreds of thousands of Israelis taking to the streets against the proposed judicial revolution by the Netanyahu government. That's beyond us. When we get back to when the reservists come home, we have a pause in the war, hopefully a ceasefire very soon. We're going to see those massive demonstrations even bigger on the streets of Israel. 80% of Israelis hold Netanyahu responsible directly for what led us to October 7th. We will have a post-Netanyahu era in the not-too-distant future.
Right. Interesting what you say, because again, when Rabin was assassinated, Arafat felt he'd lost his partner in this, and I think that point about actually not just talking about post-Netanyahu, to Samir's point again, also about post-Abbas is really important in terms of having that partnership. Royston, please.
Thank you, Chairman. Which countries do we think are best placed to play a part in any future resolution? Former colonial powers, Turkey, UK, emerging Arab powers, the United States, or even Russia, China. What sort of countries do we think are going to be part of the solution?
Yeah, I'll start. I think we're first talking about the region. So we have the countries that are at peace with Israel, Egypt and Jordan, and the Emirates and Bahrain and Morocco. All have very important roles to play. The Saudis have a crucial role to play because of their emergence of power and the reforms that are going on in Saudi Arabia, led by Prince Mohammed bin Salman. Of course, the United States has to be involved in the process together with the European Union. On a personal basis, I would say that we do not want American mediators at the table. They have done a horrible job in trying to negotiate this conflict in the past, but we need them to organize guarantees that are necessary. The European Union has to stop being a payer and be a player. And the UK has a crucial role to play because of historic consequences. And I think that my assessment is that the US is listening and watching very carefully what the United Kingdom is doing. And I think that the United Kingdom can be very influential in leading the United States to recognizing Palestine as well. Lastly, I think that it's very important to find a way to get China involved in the reconstruction of Gaza, because no one in the world knows how to build infrastructure faster, more efficiently, and cheaper than the Chinese. And with all the global difficulties with China these days between the United States and others in China, it might be a good way to help the entire global economy. And I think Gaza really needs Chinese ingenuity to move this forward.
Well, I think the global south is irrelevant in the Middle East. Normally, I would say that the leadership should be from the US towards now achieving a breakthrough. But these days, and after the amazing steps that David Cameron has been showing to the whole world since he has assumed his new position, I think for the first time, UK is a step ahead of the Americans. And if we look back to the days of Tony Blair, there has been another problem in Europe that was solved because the UK has led the USA towards a serious involvement. I think we can repeat this now. The UK can start some steps and motivate the Americans to follow them. This can lead to a solution and breakthrough. So we appreciate your leadership. We appreciate that you support your government in taking these steps. And I think the Americans are wishing now to see UK taking a step ahead of them.
I'd agree with that. Absolutely. The keys are those closest to it. Egypt and Jordan, I mean, Jordan particularly has an existential relationship with Jerusalem and the outcomes there. Egypt is obviously threatened by what's physically happening at the moment. The Gulf states are crucial. Saudi Arabia will lead those and the finance. And the US and the UK have historical roles, but it's not the same as before because there is a greater, I think, regional engagement on this issue than there was 20 or 30 years ago. So I think all those things are valid, and Samir's point about Global South is important as well. But it's interesting to note that people do see a role for the United Kingdom, and I'm pleased with that. I've, again, mentioned that in articles over the past year or so. I was always impressed when I was minister. We aren't the richest, we aren't the most powerful, we aren't the most strongest military power, but people come to us in the region because of our long history. It's not always been good, but we do know the area and we are trusted. And I think this convening role that is possible for the United Kingdom is very important. And I think the Foreign Secretary has taken it on extremely well since November.
Thank you. We've got very little time left, but I do just want to talk about Jerusalem because, as you pointed to, Alistair, it's an underlooked area. Alistair, if you could kick us off, and then I'll turn to about Gershon and Samir.
Okay. Very briefly, when Danny Seidemann and Terrestrial Jerusalem were visiting a number of capitals over the last 18 months, long before October the 7th, the concerns that were building up were on the West Bank and were on Jerusalem, particularly Al-Aqsa, the issues that were arising there. And we thought that this was very much underestimated by those who were watching the situation. That's still the case. I have a very good phrase from Terrestrial Jerusalem from 2018, but it's as pertinent today. It says this: past experience, both distant and recent, teaches us that Jerusalem is a stable, viable city when allowed to speak in its multiple voices. However, when there is an attempt to exclusively possess Jerusalem in the name of some higher order, the city erupts, often sending shockwaves throughout the region and beyond. And that has been happening. The attempt to exclusively occupy areas of Jerusalem that were not previously Jewish, the work of the planning authority in building out more of the population from Jerusalem, the pressures of the Christian community, the Armenian community in the centre of Jerusalem. This has been noticed, and it's not good, and there's not enough calling out of it. So Jerusalem remains key. Al-Aqsa, the pressures on there, the voices that we've heard, particularly Itmar Ben-Gvir, what he has said about exclusive use in Jerusalem, these are all dangerous things. And when the eye of the world is on Gaza, we mustn't neglect what's happening in Jerusalem, and we must protect its opportunity to speak with its multiple voices, because it is a city for all, and if it speaks that way, it speaks well for us.
Very beautiful way of putting it. Gershon and Samir.
Right. I think that the Clinton parameters from the year 2000 still hold firm, because Jerusalem is such a segregated city, and what Clinton has said, what is Jewish to Israel, what's Arab to the Palestinians, that's with regard to sovereignty outside the old city of Jerusalem. The old city of Jerusalem is less than 1 square kilometer, and what Prime Minister Olmert had discussed with President Abbas, which he agreed to at the time, was a 5-nation guardianship over the old city and the Holy Basin, which would be the United States, Israel, Jordan, Palestine, and Saudi Arabia. I think Morocco maybe as well. But some kind of non-sovereign situation. There would be no flags over the old city, the Holy Basin, and the holy places, but there would be a 5 or 6 nation guardianship protecting the rights of all to pray in all the holy places in Jerusalem. It is a political problem. It is not a religious problem in terms of the holy places, because they're holy to the same God and for the same monotheistic religions. But it is a question of control, and that needs to be taken away from Israel having unilateral control over all of these places. That's the spark here, and we have to recognize that what the Jews call the Temple Mount and the Muslims call Al-Aqsa is the nuclear raw nerve of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And every time there's been a major eruption It's because someone has tried to change the status quo there. So that's what we need to be careful of and not allow to happen.
Thank you. Samir.
Well, I hate to see Jerusalem divided, even in a two-state solution. I think Jerusalem should be united. Now it is divided. It should be a city for two peoples, a capital for two states, and it should be the capital for the three religions. It is very important for Jews, it's very important for Muslims, for Christians, and there is no way that any side can claim exclusivity on the city. It should be shared by everybody. But again, now what is more important, in order to be able to reach to some kind of political breakthrough, I think the two main obstacles now, it's two leaders, one on the Israeli side, Netanyahu, which apparently now the Israelis are recognizing and realizing the urgency of changing the power in Israel, and we leave it to them. And it's Mr. Mahmoud Abbas. And I wrote an open-ed on the 21st of December in New York Times under the title Mahmoud Abbas Should Go. I explained how we can motivate the president in an easy way, in a provide him a respectful exit, where he stays to be a ceremonial president. He gets lifetime immunity with his friends and aides and family, and he delivers against this all his power to a new government. Without these changes, we will be, all of us, hostages to these current leaders that are not able or capable to achieve any progress.
Well, thank you. Thank you all for... Go on, Alistair. 30 seconds.
Just please, in your recommendations, your main recommendation to the world should be don't give up. Don't give up. When we've given up in the past, that's one of the reasons we are where we are. We mustn't give up now.
Can I encourage Gershon to carry on with his excellent newsletter, which I read every time I receive one? Thank you.
Here we go. On that note of optimism, can I thank you all for such a sensitive discussion on what is truly a very important topic. So thank you all ever so much. Order, order. That's the end of the session.
The proceeding has ended. 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 The proceeding has ended.